Good evening, and we're very grateful for the Architecture League for this prestigious event tonight. And the fact that it's the 30th anniversary makes it that much more special. And we applaud our hats off for the continuous effort to promote emerging young practitioners around in North America. I just want to start by telling you quickly about our beginnings. This being about emerging practices, I think it is important to show the dirty laundry of coming on about offices. And I really appreciate when people are candid about themselves. I think it is important. I'm sorry, my screen keeps on jumping. To tell the whole story. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the practice of architecture in Montreal and in Canada as well, and how those little accumulated experiences have been shaping our path. And we started our practice in 1997. My partner, Manon Asselin, could not be here tonight, unfortunately. First of all, as Dan was telling you, we are married. We are one of those practices. And it is quite common in Canada, as I assume it's all over the world. This is a natural progression for many architects. I think it is one of the few professions where there are so many committed and successful husband and wife teams, but that is a whole different topic that I won't cover tonight. I think it has to do something with passion, whether you survive or not. And maybe with the excruciatingly long gestation period for projects. I think in order to practice and have a family in architecture, this is a good way. Running your own design office is a strange thing in a sense that one day you'll be drawing a plan, the next day you'll be paying bills, and the next you'll be writing up offer services, preparing lectures, taking out the garbage, and so on. And unlike working in a big office, the scope of your work is undefined, and I think this is good because you might never get bored, but it's not good if you get distracted, as I do. And I think at the beginning of your career, one tends to meander the most, and the result is a very messy, sometimes seemingly incoherent type of practice. And there's a daily struggle to fend for some kind of clarity in the sea of seemingly arbitrary demands from all directions. And maintaining a sense of normalcy and a front of professionalism only adds to the daily anxiety of running a design office. Some days, we cannot help but contemplate the words of Oscar Niemeyer, who said, architecture is consequence. So almost 15 years ago, we bought a 4-story Victorian building in the McGill Ghetto, which is a residential area right adjacent to McGill University. And it became our first little building lab. And the Greystone building dates back to 1875, and we could still trace the deeds of sales since when the land belonged to the Queen of England, as Canada is a Commonwealth country. So we started our practice out of our own house. And in the first 10 years, we moved offices 4 times within the same building. This was us in 1997, that was in 2000, in 2002. And 2006 until we moved 2 blocks from our original house, but basically we keep the same configuration between our private life and our practice. And I think this is a very practical way of starting up an office to remain flexible in its organization. And I think the sharing of infrastructure and resources of the professional life and the personal life makes sense since the business of architecture is practically open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it actually makes a lot of sense, your life a lot easier if your partner is your spouse, and some people might disagree. And I don't know how Louis Kahn did it with 3 families, but that's another story. So we used our house to practice, literally, and it was an extremely rewarding and fun decade, I think, looking back, about learning the basic difference between the line that exists on a paper and its counterpart on the physical world. I think a simple opening represented by 3 lines on an elevation translates to cracked ceilings, desperately trying to save 150-year-old moldings that nobody knows how to reproduce anymore, and then lifting up a beam that takes 5 football player-sized carpenters to hoist up, and hearing the whole building crack every time you cut a stud down. So this was our kind of a harsh reality of what construction could be. Another thing is, usually when you start out, this is the dilemma you're faced with. Everybody knows this catch-22, I guess. So in many ways, I think design offices become multidisciplinary unintentionally. And we're constantly reinventing ourselves to respond to the arbitrary demands of the work that comes in through our doors. And this is made possible, of course, a little bit because of our arrogance and naivete, but more so we would like to think because of our understanding that the contribution we make to society is not purely technical. So we often don't know how some things are done or built, but this is not necessarily a problem. Because if it was about know-how, soon it would be about efficiency. And unfortunately, this kind of perception of architecture is very much present in the current practices. Since we started our office, we worked in many competitions for ourselves and other people. And designed furniture, did some art installations. And this kind of haphazard approach might make you feel conflicted about the value of the work you produce, but for us, it got us involved in the part of the work that mattered most to us, which was the production or the translation of the idea in the physical form. So, and perhaps also giving us a glimpse into what alternate form or practice could be by dealing directly with the people that produce the work and truly understand the limitations and possibilities of and try to come up with solutions to different hurdles, finding solutions that ultimately suited our purpose. For this installation, for example, to commemorate the founding of Montreal, we met this incredible welder. His name is Michel Bernier, and he works with artists that are fairly well known in Montreal, like Betty Goodwin. And you could give him anything, and he would make it better than you could ever imagine. We call him the Obearup of welders. And the installation was essentially a door with a name of the first family who came to Montreal, cut out with a computer-controlled water jet, which is like a laser cutter, but instead of having a router or a laser on it, it has a nozzle that shoots water mixed with sand at a high pressure of about 2,000 pounds per square foot. And in the late 90s, this was an amazing discovery for us that you could actually perforate steel with using water. And it had an underground component to it. And during the day, the mirror glass on the ground would reflect the doors of the Montreal City Hall. The site was right across the Montreal City Hall. And at night, the surface would project an image of the map of the first settlements of the 1642. And it was made out of corten steel. So our practice began officially in 2001 with the resurgence of open anonymous competitions in the province of Quebec as a result of a new policy put forth by the Ministry of Culture. It enforced a competition system to award contracts to any projects that were benefiting from public funds. So the way it usually works is the government foots about 50% of the bill for construction projects. So at the time, we had very little knowledge about real construction techniques, so we became, as a result of this lack of knowledge, extremely suspicious of systems that are out there and look more into the possible ways to collaborate with the trades to achieve what we thought would help our architecture some level of authenticity that we admired in the works of many architects. So a central preoccupation in the practice has been about making, I guess, and or translation or intentions from one passive medium to an active one. So a lot of energy was spent thinking how we could move away from pre-existing systems that have an inherent look to it. So in the context of North America, where contracts are drafted with the assumption that something would go wrong, this becomes quite a challenge, how to try to stretch the limits without voiding the warranty of what you use. So this was another experiment back in 1997. It was a stair made of laminated plywood built by one of my colleagues. His name is Dimitri Kubatis. We call him the human CNC machine. We're just using a flush bit with a router. He created a lamination of 22/7 laminations of 7-ply plywood to extrude a stair with an integrated string groove in it. So I think I mean, it's almost 15 years old, but we still like what we did with it. I don't think there's a single architecture student that coming out of school did not design some kind of a furniture, and this was another little experiment we did back then. It's a Belgian black stone bench floating on a cross brace of a 1/2 inch, really thin stainless steel rod. Just by the way the rod is bent, you can support a lot of load on something very minimal. So we work with the same welder, using leftover materials from other projects. So Quebec within Canada is by far one that holds the most architectural competitions. These are all the lists of competitions that were held in Canada since 1867. The first one was a farmhouse. And we were shortlisted. We entered about 8 out of those, because a lot of them were not qualified to enter. And these were the 3 that we actually won, that went through the second phase and we were awarded the project for. So you noticed that during those periods, we were not doing too well. We had a little baby and then eventually a second one. As Dan was talking about, it completely changes your life. And those were our turbulent years of trying to deal with the family life and then still try to run your own independent practice. The only thing I could tell you about that is that sleep and memory are very much linked together, and it affects your work. The fact that most of the competitions are held in Quebec within Canada has certainly elevated the quality of the work. And in 2006, for example, 8 out of the 12 Governor General medals, which is the highest distinction, went to Quebec offices. And we got 2 for our first 2 projects, and we had a really good jury for that year. And all of this was great for us, and we thought we might, our career would take off from that point on. But it didn't happen in a stellar way, we thought. And instead, we were hit with a few hard realities of the profession, one of budget and the other of time frame. And our work stemmed from the process of architectural competitions that supposedly, through its mechanism, promotes innovation in design. And we decided to look into the timeline of the architectural contract and came to the conclusion that the odds were stacked against us. In our experience, the short timeline that the competitions project offers, a lot of it, the design phase per se is extremely short compared to the actual execution phase. And there's no doubt in our mind that competition encourages experimentation, but innovation, on the other hand, we feel is very much tied to construction costs and to time. And to innovate, to do something new or different, means to some extent to deviate from what the construction industry knows how to do, which usually translates to costing more money or more time. And when we think of innovating, for example, with the building envelope, it implies having the time to do the research, to build mock-ups, having the time to work with the industry, trying new assembly methods, and still, while doing all of that, making sure that the client can maintain some kind of a warranty for the system that it's being placed. So this has been always a problem in our design process. So, and this from this mindset that our interest in practice of architecture grew as a way to cope with the seemingly impossible reality of having a productive career that was both personally fulfilling and also sustainable, but not in the ecological sense, but in the sense of sanity, especially having children make it that much harder to have a productive and fulfilling time designing things. Not that they're bad, but it's just that you just don't have the time to do it. And this is an ongoing research in our office. It was Rome Prize research that we've recently completed the interview phase, traveling throughout the world. And it tries to identify possible futures of design practice or design methods. And I might have come knocking on your doors here in New York last summer, and we're looking into the design processes and distilling through accumulated experiences of multiple offices around the world, the most fertile territory where one can be most effective. It is a slow and meditative observation about finding commonalities and differences within our generation of architects. But it also tries to identify, on the wake of what sustainability have become, what is innovation in our field. So architecture is a profession that is very humbling. The more you know, the more you realize how little you know about it. We have come to realize, however, that precisely it is this lack of experience is what often gives young emerging architects a certain exuberance about their work. And as you gain experience, you tend to nip the buds of great ideas too prematurely. And this is a concern for us. And we are often asked the question, what is the design, the office philosophy or design intentions, or how do we start? And we're irked by this question simply because we don't have a simple, straightforward, and convincing answer. When we look at the strength of project, there are two words that seems to stand out. One is clarity, and the other ambiguity, and both used as positive qualifiers. And we believe that the experiential realm is less tangible and rational, but at the same time, also that is the territory with most longevity. So I would like to present 3 of the projects that we have completed over the last 10 years. So it's a long time span. At the same time, it is not very long considering how long architecture takes to produce. And perhaps looking at them from different perspectives or lenses to give insight into our practice and the context and the process. So the first project I would like to talk about is the Municipal Library in Chateauguay. This was one of the open anonymous competitions that happened in almost 5 years in the province of Quebec. Before that, it was a request for services, or it was a pre-qualification system, and then this one came about. So the drive from Montreal to Chateauguay is quite surreal. As you cross a bridge, it's called the Mercier Bridge, the South Shore condition starts, which is a series of billboards that announces tobacco and karate dojo advertisements. And the reason for that is because between Chateauguay and Montreal, there is a territory that is it's a reserve for the First Nations people. They're the Mohawks, and they have almost a little independent country that is fenced off. And the only way they survive economically is by selling tobacco, and then they are basically taking advantage of that stretch of land that they have to advertise what they have to sell. So on our first visit, we kept on driving until we got to the most historical part of the city and found this little windmill, which happened to be one of the oldest structures in Chateauguay. We were intrigued by its materiality and its ambiguous relation to the landscape and its iconic presence. And in the midst of this kind of a non-context, we're trying to find some anchoring reference that could speak to the people of Chateauguay, to the jury themselves. So the actual site of the competition was the Civic Park, and circumscribed by buildings which housed some civic functions. There was a gymnasium, a skating rink, a swimming pool, and a cultural center, and a newly erected youth center and a police station right next to it. So walking on the site, the most prominent memory we had was this undulation on the ground that existed on the park, and as you can see on this photo, and a small cluster of trees creating an interesting light pattern on the surface of these undulations. So our strategy was to integrate these level changes that result from the undulations into organization of the building program. We also wanted to have as small as possible contact to the ground to disturb as little as possible the existing park and its trees. So we first imagined a 5-story tower of books which would become a backdrop of to the civic park. So the life of the library and that of the park start to create a dialogue. But after the first phase, we were asked to lower the building to a maximum of 3 stories. And so the tower got turned to its side. And this was actually an interesting thing for us because now we had this hovering volume over the landscape. And because we maintained a small contact of the building to the ground, we could start blurring the edge of the building. What I mean about that is that one starts to experience the architecture before you are inside the building itself. This is further reinforced by introducing these 3 light courts into the rotated tower, which organizes the reading room inside by providing natural daylight and also connect the outside to the inside of the building. And by separating the program of the library in terms of noisy zones and quiet zones, the basic organization of the library became the noisy part on the level of the park and the quiet part here in the gray zone in the upper 2 levels. So just to briefly situate you, here is the main entrance into the building, the ground floor, the 2nd and 3rd. And you can see the 2 light courts represented in yellow and a blue children's mound that's related to the children reading area. So the ground plane of the building follows the counters of the site, and it splits in 2 via a grand stair. So this is the ground floor plan. And this was the active, noisy part of the building where people in the park could stroll into the library from all directions. And we strongly wanted to open a glazed facade to the park itself, but it was refused by the librarians due to control issues. And then the more traditional functions of the library were located on the upper 2 levels, you can see here. And as you puncture through the main staircase going up, you arrive to this quiet part of the library that starts by this sloping plane, which we call the browsing plane, where all the references of the library were located. And we saw this as an artificial extension of the natural topography, so the berm of the park comes to meet that sloping plane. And then we wanted to create that close connection between the landscape and the inner spaces of the library. So this sloping plane or platform is where you actually do the research, look up for books, and where the loans and returns are controlled, as well as giving visual clues as to where the collections are located. So here the stair going through the slope plane, and on the right signage wall was created to indicating all the collections. And once you arrive to the browser plane, and you find a book, you enter into the dense stack of the books. And within this, you discover the clearings, which are reading areas, giving you view backs to the exterior, as well as diagonally between different floor levels. So these are some of the views looking through the light courts. And this is looking back up towards the children's reading area. It's an inverted kind of a cutout. And the idea here was that we were gonna, on the landscape plan, we wanted to introduce this blue mound made out of rubberized asphalt that my partner imagined that it would be amusing if kids could tease each other as they're stuck doing homework, and then their friends could come up without actually entering the building, poke their head, and then call out on them. And we like this kind of play and kind of a whimsy in our projects. The structure of the building was quite straightforward, except perhaps for the sloping floor and green roof that was conceived as a continuum of the landscape. And originally, we imagined that the underside of the sloping floor should be free, that it should float over the landscape, kind of like this, to reinforce the sense of continuity. So initially, we thought we could delicately suspend it from the ceiling, and we had visions of fine, kind of elegant suspension members holding up the sloped floor. Then the engineers came back with their own version, which was now completely clogging up the actual sloping floor. And after several ineffective attempts to deal with them, we came to the conclusion that perhaps we should just hold the sloping floor delicately with inclined columns, so that the columns act as artificial tree trunks, and we introduced instead this 30-meter long post-tensioned beam to liberate any kind of structure from that sloped plane. So here in elevation, you can see this is what spanned, large span post-tension beam, and a view from the park in the summer night, kind of still participating in that park life. And the other tricky part of the structure was a part of the library that sinks into the mound, and so this part that was kind of a triangulated plane. And we wanted this to be completely independent from the rest of the building structure, so we had to come up with this column that is essentially a few inches away from that slab that comes to meet it. And obviously the engineers find it completely inefficient to do something like that, but we needed that tension of kind of the experience to emphasize the experience of going underground. So we were very involved with the site supervision phase, and it was fascinating and daunting to see the lines he drew becoming solid walls of concrete. And obviously there's no undos once you get to the building point. And here's a photo of that landscape lifting up. And here are other images of the reading room, this upper reading room where it's pulled out from the binding of the stone wall, like a shelf. Images. So being on site is the best way you can learn about other ways of doing things, and this is another advantage of obviously running your own office. You get to spend a couple of nice afternoons talking to the workers on site. And then this is the finished wall. It's a floating masonry wall on the landscape. So this is the main facade from the street. The building becomes like a billboard of stone, kind of a strange marriage of context and history. So the next project, which is the competition for the theater in Terrebonne, was announced the week our tender documents for the library had to be finished. So we literally finished the working drawings, and the next morning we started working on the competition for that. This was another two-phase anonymous competition. The site for the Haute Terrebonne was a contrast to that of Chateauguay. It had a lot of history, and it was beautiful, and frankly, it was, in our mind, quite inappropriate for a theater, in a sense. This is the old part of the city of Terrebonne, and there is the green area along the river, and it was developed, the whole area was developed by local residents, and this is one thing that is quite unique in Montreal and this periphery, that a lot of these kind of grassroots organizations do a lot of preservation and make projects happen. So it has a library, it has a sculptural garden. It's all quite beautiful. And this was the little portion of the park that was given for the competition. It used to have a little baseball field in it, as you can see in the shape. So the basic requirement was this, a black box in a 600, that could seat 600 people. A theater in the park, and for us this was problematic because the theater operates during the night, and during the day it is usually inaccessible. So in this case, the type of auditorium was somewhat predetermined by the scenographic consultants that the client had hired prior to the competition. It was a 600-seat fixed Italian style theater. So traditionally, a theater is an introverted building type. So for us, the exercise was to reconcile the integration of this introverted building type into the park. So in order to do this, we needed to rethink the constituent parts of the program, such as the washrooms, the bar, the circulation, and the washroom, and create meaningful relation between these program elements and the park. So we imagined spatial experiences in form of gardens inserted into the theater. And this was not as an additive element to the given program, but as a way to requalify the given program. So in a way, expanding the program of the theater beyond the boundaries of the physical building envelope. So as a visitor to the theater, moving towards the auditorium proper becomes the predominant part of the experience of the building. So we wanted to make this movement the primary spatial quality of it. So instead of imagining a series of program elements connected by circulation, the circulation morphs to accommodate the programmatic requirements. And the gardens that cut into the building allowed us to invent or create the platform to investigate a new kind of relation between the visitors to the park and those to the theater. So we introduced, we call the double-deck stair. It's in section, where there's an inside stair and an outside stair, one going to the roof terrace, freely accessible from the park, and the other one that goes to the upper foyer. So physically puts the stroller in the park on top of the visitors to the theater, to the users. And the lower interior stair is for accessing the balcony levels and the bar, and the upper exterior stairs to access the rooftop terrace directly from the park. So the bar becomes a reference point around which you move, and after all, alcohol is an important social lubricator. So the idea is that the life of the park intersects the activities of the theater and animates it, creating a symbiotic relationship between the two. And in this sense, we're also interested in the spectacle of theater going as a social act where being seen becomes as important as seeing, where the observer is clandestinely transformed into the observed. And this becomes particularly true to people who purchase the more expensive loggia seats with its own private bar in the back. So here in blue, in plan of the balcony level, the red is the corridor or the program space. And these private lounges are glazed to the public. So here you can see it painted in blue. And this is a view from the lower lounge looking out. And this has nothing to do with daylighting, even though you could get a few points on the lead system. But this was a way to pull out some of the psychological plays that are usually reserved to the inner spaces of the theater and connect it back to the outside world and ultimately directly to the park. So you move towards the spaces that are reserved for an exclusive, and at the end, you kind of pop back to where everyone is, and kind of an involuntary exhibitionism and giving an audience to the VIP. And they're also visually interconnected between themselves. So the upper level loggia can look inside the lower level. Structurally, this was the original proposal. We wanted to demonstrate this drama of circulation space by cantilevering out the foyer box as a floating volume. And like in the library, blurring the kind of a threshold or extending the fall-off of the interior to the exterior. And the box beam that holds up the foyer was like a crane, essentially picking it up from the roof. And this was after the realization that, as usual, there's not enough money. So part of the upper foyer got cut and became a roof terrace, directly accessible from the bar. And finally, this was after the structural engineer realized that he miscalculated the budget by 50%. But to his defense, there's a lot of stuff going on in China at the moment, so a lot of the steel had been shipped there, which boosted the steel price. But at the end, we introduced this column disguised as a signage that kind of still maintains that sense of suspension on the soffit space. So as I was saying, the production architecture in Montreal, and probably for that matter in North America in general, tends to become very prescriptive. And this is particularly true when it comes to the exterior envelope of the building. Oftentimes you end up specifying products from catalogs with minimum, maximum dimensions, certain acceptable details, so you won't void the warranty, etc. And we find this very frustrating part of the practice. So when we were asked by the acoustic engineer to come up with some kind of a wall treatment, we jumped to the opportunity, and then we want to try to do something from scratch. And we had met this rep. It's a Moroccan artisan that does traditional Victorian moldings that had visited our office because he's a resident of Chateauguay. So we called him up, And we produce 3 types of acoustic panels for sound propagation out of a fiberglass reinforced plaster. So an acoustic consultant usually does this in MDF, which he paints, and we find MDF is a terrible material. But so this guy basically produced all of this in his garage, about 900 little panels on its own, and came on site and hung them. So this is some of those views. And they are gray because of the requirements of the theater consultants. The interior of the theater had to be easy to control in terms of lighting. But instead of just painting them, the pigment itself was mixed into the plaster. So even if it chips or cracks, the color remains the same throughout. And with time, they would develop a patina, like how certain natural materials like stone or wood would do. So we also poured some of the coping details on the theater. And this is some of the views of the interior of the auditorium. We do a lot of mock-ups in our office. We don't do the real size, but we often do some in foam core. Specifically, we're trying to check the clearances because they're quite deep. They're almost 16 inches deep, and see how it would feel once you're sitting on the upper levels. And this is kind of a finished view of it. So here you can see all the panels covering the walls of the auditorium. And this is the close-up of the panels. And the blue light is from the private lounges that the VIP people could use. This was another exercise in budget cutting. We had created this topographic ceiling plane. And so here we use expanded metal, kind of like here actually. It was interesting to come in here to see this. It's much nicer here, but back then we were just trying to solve a very serious issue of budget. And then we discovered that we could just use perforated expanded metal and bend it to give it some stiffness and create our own interlocking system. And the whole ceiling was, in terms of material cost, was so negligible that obviously was accepted by the client. And the ceiling kind of sinks down into the lower level. This is the main lower level, this main stair going up to the foyer. And we were exploring all kinds of, we do a lot of large-scale models, and the great thing about big-scale models is that you suddenly find a lot of fat in building that already exists, especially in building types like theaters, because there's a lot of level changes. So we created an extra space without paying more for it by using the underside of the seating. And that was a small little room that you would enter that acts as a SAS for the upper level. So, and then also from that you could look back out. So we have these kind of extra spaces that kind of look inside one another. And here's the shot of that room. It's all painted in red for the sake of drama. And then the stair taking up to the balcony level. And this was the back side of the theater. And we devised a little trellis for support for a bind over the cheap stucco material that we had to use. And as part of the siding strategy, we mitigated the height of the fly tower by berming up the landscape. And then we kind of extended that same motion with an undulating green wall that still needs to grow. And this green wall wraps around the corner of the roof terraces. And this is where the administration block is. And then the people who work inside on a daily basis can just step out into the theater itself, into the park itself without going through the main entrance. So this is the double deck stair with a VIP lounge kind of hovering into the park. It's another view. And this is the kind of a green room right underneath it, painted green. And the rest of the building was covered in zinc using a traditional method called tôle à la canadienne, which is a Canadian-style flashing, if you want. So local people who do a lot of silver flashing roofs submitted to do the work. So we kind of use that. And this is the exterior stair going up to the roof terraces. And here, the materiality of the soffit is quite important for us because we wanted to express, kind of give a sense of puncturing through a mass. And then, so we didn't want any sort of articulation in terms of whatever that needed to be put in there. So the lighting fixtures were kind of embedded. And every time you have a lighting fixture, you basically have a play of spacing. So the lighting could be integrated within that. And this is a view back once you're on the roof terrace. So you arrive in here, and then you're looking at the big river that runs right adjacent to the park. And this is the third project that I will talk about, which was our last competition entry that dates back to 2008. And it was another municipal library project in St. Hubert, which is another community south of the island of Montreal. So in our 15 years, we always kind of outside the island. We haven't been able to build on the island of Montreal yet. We're still working on it. And it is a typical North American suburb with very little context to speak about. So one thing that was particularly interesting was this. We found this photo of the landing of a Zeppelin in 1930s on the airport of St. Hubert. And we did a bit of research and realized that since the beginning of the 20th century, St. Hubert's built environment has been closely linked to Quebec's aeronautic industry. So the headquarters for companies like Pratt and Whitney and Canadian space agencies are located there. So we also came to realize that due to its geographic location, St. Hubert benefits from unique meteorological conditions, resulting from remarkable potential for wind energy. So we wanted to imagine the potential for the architecture of the new library as sculpted in response to this force of nature, so poetically materializing and kind of celebrating the presence of the wind while technically seeking to take advantage of resource for its bioclimatic strategy. So as a suburb of Montreal, the city itself was not particularly attractive, as I said. Although it is a large green park, it is also quite schizophrenic. It is bordered on one side by a high-speed provincial highway, while on the other there's this bucolic green park that has no real sense of presence because you just kind of enter through this small dirt road. So the building site it's represented approximately by this white rectangle. So also in recently attitudes towards competitions have changed a lot. There's an increased kind of focus on issues of sustainability to be kind of the main part of the competition entry. And in fact, this was one of the first competitions in Quebec that was an integrated design approach, meaning that from the competition phase, the client wanted us to team up with structural engineers and mechanical engineers to approach it together. So the white patch, as I was saying, identifies the approximate area of the program and potentially implying that we had to cut a lot of trees. So the concept we came up was this one of the flying carpet. So in relation to the wooded side, our instinct was to try to do something that would have the least impact on the forest, so something that would float above the site. So the experience combined with the history of the town, we thought a flying carpet would be was an interesting kind of a reference point for it. So the concept became very simply a flying carpet made of wood, that it's a filigree construction that would levitate over the site and would symbolically give back the wood to the forest itself. So here's one of the first competition renderings. The upper part of the building is what we think of as the habitable thickness of the flying carpet. And while the ground floor remains transparent, it opens up onto the public place and it creates a dialogue with the tree trunks. So as such, the architectural concept of the flying carpet was not thought simply as an architectural gesture, but also as an elementary bioclimatic response to the site program. That is, the geometry of the building speaks of the renewable resources of the earth, mainly the wind, the sun, and the rain, here in French. And the envelope was conceived as a climatic device or the filter around which you organize your program. So this was the view from the ground floor main service counter looking back towards the public space. And the programmatic elements are organized in a single continuous movement that unfolds from the public place to the forest, delineating a central open court, very much like a cloister of a monastery. This exterior court forms the geographic, social, and perceptual heart of the building. And it is in a way a variation on the idea of the cloisters as a contemplative space, a space of light and quiet where the reading room is located. And as for the traditional cloister, one circulates around it to go from collection to collection. So just to orient you here is the overall shot of the model showing the public place with the retention basin for rainwater collection. And that basin also acts as a proper, what we like to call a threshold to the park itself. So you see also very well here the geometry of the roof, which is reflected in the ceiling topography. And the ground floor plan forms a U, while the upper floor plan becomes a full donut. So it the full donut obviously delimitates the cloister, and then all the collections are organized around it. And on the front facade, we find the main reading area, bridging and forming the porte cochere, which is meant to say the gateway into the public space of the library. And it also acts as a programmatic signal for people that walk on the parks, and they can see the people reading in there. So you can see on the model, the roofscape was shaped according to the prevailing winds on site. Essentially, we positioned the building inside data of predominant winds and try to sculpt or adjust the heights of the roofs so that we could create a natural ventilation flow over that would help the interior ventilation. So here are a pretty standard diagram showing the ventilation strategies. So the high ceiling allows for ventilation by displacement and natural stratification, which maximizes the comfort of the occupants. And also the protected microclimate of the central court provides cooling, helps cooling loads, or it helps the cooling loads by allowing operable windows to open during the summer. And a large amount of floor-to-ceiling fenestration and the operable windows also allow for intimate relation with the park. A lot of our buildings used to be closed, especially libraries where book controls are important. So we wanted the people reading to be able to smell or feel a breeze as they're reading. So in the summer, the rain that is collected in the retention basin will evaporate and further cool off the microclimate of the court. And the building is also equipped with the passage geothermal. And when cooling needs exceeds the passage geothermal, the capacity geothermal fields would provide 100% of the building energies. Okay. Here was the structural strategy we put forth to the engineers during the competition. And unfortunately, engineers do not get very passionate about architectural competitions. And we learned from our past two experiences that unless you come up with something to deal with the budget issue, which is a central concern for us in Montreal. I mean, we don't build for $30 an hour, $30 a square foot, but our budgets are not extravagant either. So basically, we wanted this to be buildable by anybody who deals with steel. So we came up with this idea, essentially laying the grid out, and we identified what would be special steel members. Yeah, so here it's represented in the red beams, which have a kink, and the yellow beams are the ones that define the valleys and the ridges. And the rest of the structure was basically the same as a standard Home Depot kind of construction. So that kind of convinced the engineer, well, that got the engineer very excited, and then he really got involved in the project from that point on. So here you can see in construction, and you can see almost the topography of the roof forming. And this is the overall building in its skeletal form, the very important opening to the sky and the piece of the garden that descends to the reading room, and the gesture that can be seen all the way from across the parking or from the arrival to the site. And I really resent the fact that envelopes are so thick in our climate, because there's something beautiful about the structure. And I often think what Niemeyer said about how once the structure is done, the architecture is finished, which I find it's really true to what we do. And here's a quick model of the corresponding ceiling topography, and we do a lot of these kind of small models. And then the roof plan showing some of the green areas. I think in particular, this part, we wanted the roof to descend down. Okay, sorry, I'm going a little slow. I'll try to rush through. And this was a way to make the green roof not just a kind of a independent element up in the sky, but to allow it to participate in the reading spaces. So when the season changes, the flowers would actually change the light in the reading rooms. I'll just move fast. So we do a lot of mock-ups. This was done by me. That's a little mock-up in the garage. And then this was a 12-foot mock-up that was used on site to make the louvers. And as you can see here on the plan, the louvers were kind of rotated around the building to adjust to the light. And here's some of the renderings you can see. And then our filigree construction. And this was some of the views from the inside, looking out through that. Again, going back, some of those views in structural, kind of a diagrammatic form, where the building is in innocent form, where you can actually start to appreciate most the relation to the forest and some of the interior spaces. And this was another realization on site that it is quite difficult to build a triangle coming to a point on a big building, because then all the water and snow would accumulate there. So it was a big learning experience, but I think here you can start to see the roof kind of participating in that space. And here it's in its final kind of a money shot of architecture that we see in magazines. And actually that plane, it's cut out on the floor slab. So from the youth collection, you can look down into the children's section. And then this is the way looking back up, looking into the court as well. And the building has, because of its form, has sectional qualities that are unexpected and actually quite wonderful, that you can see part of the facade and part of the section through this from one standing point. And from the inner court, looking back to the park, you can the reflectivity on the glass creates this kind of a kaleidoscopic world where you see the forest reflected, but you also see it in transparency, which is quite nice. And then these are some of the ideas of the clearing that were reintroduced back. This is the structure kind of shaping up. And then some of the interior working rooms with skylights. We call this the North Star. And the two levels are connected through the main stair. and the ceiling comes down, acting a little bit like a reverse funnel to pick you up from the lower level. So there's a sense of continuity between the two floor levels. And this is finally the finished stair, cladded in wood, going back up. And okay, the last bit I would talk about is the wood itself in institutional buildings were not very welcome because of these maintenance issues. But we really wanted to push the idea of the wood because the forest and the idea of giving back the wood to its wood. So through research, we found this carbonized wood, which is essentially baking the wood so that it is completely dried up. And it was a method. It was interesting because you can use woods like poplar, which are essentially reserved for interior uses only on an exterior cladding system. And they're quite nice wood because they had uniform grain. And but the problem was that the client had never really used it, so they really wanted us to be able to guarantee it. So one way of kind of managing that risk was for us to come up with an idea that you could make this in panels and then have it removed if ever something goes wrong. But at the same time, we discovered that because the hourly wages between workers in a shop are different from workers on site, which is much more expensive than workers on site, it became a real money saver to actually propose it like that. So the building, this is the panels starting to go up on site. And then they're all done in 2-foot sections, so you could actually take it off if something goes wrong. And this is the inner court once it's been finished. And some of the soffit views, as you can see, all of those were kind of important parts. And this is the view of the water basin where the rainwater percolates through those stacked stones. We didn't want it to be a reflective pool because the water would never be clear enough, but that it would actually create vegetation through the rocks was interesting. And that's my last slide, and thank you for your attention.